a program officer at ICJ Kenya. And I'll be moderating this session on gender, and I would like to invite my esteemed panelists to the front. As they find their way to the front, I would like to inform you that this particular panel discussion on gender, feminism, and inclusion of women in governance and democratic processes is very important for the future of our East African region. So while we are still at a juncture where progress has been made, we have seen imminent challenges that have hindered involvement of women in democratic processes. So, and we are going to be joined by our experts here, panelists, who are very passionate about women's rights, and they are at the forefront of pushing for this meaningful change. So we will explore the current situation, we'll also delve into the challenges and also the solutions moving forward. So before I introduce my panelists, kindly note that we will take questions after each of the panelists have spoken. And we will have 4 panelists. One of the panelists will be joining us virtually. So I'm going to start by introducing the first panelist, who is Samia El Hashim. Samia is a distinguished lawyer and a co-founder of the Chairwomen of Mutaniwat, an organization that uses law as a strategic tool for positive change for women in Sudan. Mutaniwat prioritizes women's rights in constitution and engagement of women in constitution writing. Samia is also a recipient of the Franco-German Award for Human Rights and the Rule of Law in 2024. So Samia, welcome. And a round of applause for Samia. So Samia, based on your extensive expertise on legal reform, where do you think the laws are falling short in breaking down patriarchal barriers that impede women's involvement in governance processes? Samia, you have 10 minutes.
Thank you so much for having me in this panel. And let me protest first. Most of the men left, and I think this is, we need to think and to think twice about why women issues or women presentation is not interesting or not important. So I think we need to tell them tomorrow in the recap why they left. So, okay. As for my experience in legal reform and engagement of women in political arena, I think we start with the legal framework, govern or rules women mobility, women engagement in public arena. The case of my country, Sudan, we have struggled long time ago with legal reform. Actually, we start with, we have a law called Public Order Law. This law restrict women and determine the dress code and mobility of women. Women can't travel unless they get permission from male guardian in the family, even if he's a son or young brother or a husband, of course. And we managed to repeal that law. But still it is mindset, this rule of law, this public order. So although it was, there is no law called public order law, still the mindset of policymakers and even in the judiciary system and the judges, it is in their mind. Also, the personal matter laws is something restricted women from not only divorce, economical rights. It is maintenance is very much related to obey husbands. So it's not only the constitution is perfect and talking about equality and talking about the importance and of repealing laws that contradict the constitution, but it's still women are restricted, and also the political parties law is never stated that women should be part of the political party. So women are not always in the front line or in the decision-making positions in the political parties. Therefore, they are just numbers used to vote for the men. So we think we need legal framework allows women for political participation, meaningful political participation, and also the quota. It is 40% for women, but it was never met because women are not given the space to be in the decision-making positions in their political parties or in public life. So always they are, when we are protest against this, they are saying we have 2 women here, we have a minister, we have a judge, like this, but they are not. The approach is not a bottom-up approach for women inclusion or women participation. So also lack of being part of the regional and international legal framework for women like CEDAW or the Mobutu Protocol. Sudan up to now is not part of this regional and international framework for women, and they are using religious also to and always they are talking about CEDAW is about freedom of sexuality and freedom of for the family, that women can marry themselves without the consent of the family. So they are using misinformation to prevent the government from ratifying this framework. What we need is codify gender equality, ratify CEDAW and Mobutu Protocol, enforce quota, and support women's movement. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Samia. And before you put on the microphone, I would like you to shed more light on your experience on women involvement in peace processes and transitions. Are there any lessons that East African nations could draw from that experience?
Yeah, actually, I have lived-in experience. I have been engaged in peace processes in Sudan, which is now much needed. And I want East Africa region to benefit from our experience and to take it as a mirror. Start from making the change within the country because of dictatorship or because of conflict, and the engagement of women in all these peace processes is something can't be compromised. We need women to be part and parcel from for the peace talks and for the make them to be engaged in these peace talks or peacemaking right from the beginning. So what we need is to link. This is not for elites only or for educated women. Peace is something related to the people, to the normal life, going to school, having hospitals, live a normal life. So the voices of women on the ground or in the grassroots is something important, and they need to be part of these processes. And community peace dialogue is something very important. And also, I think the mediations teams also, technical team, we need women to be in the technical teams. And I think 1325 resolution, the Security Council resolution, give us the framework that women should be part and parcel, not only for the countries that running under conflict or under conflict right now, but the engagement of women even before or if they are in peace, they need to be part of any peace talks. And peace talks doesn't mean between conflict, only between conflict parties or conflict frictions. Peace is about communities, and it's about people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samia. And we'll proceed with our conversation on peaceful processes with our second panelist, who is Sarah Kasande. Sarah is an advocate of courts of judicature in Uganda and serves as the head office of the International Center for Transitional Justice in Uganda and the head of the Initiative for Transitional Justice in Africa. She has a passion for social justice and human rights and possesses over 13 years of experience in peace building and transitional justice programming at the grassroots, national, and regional levels. So Sarah, welcome so much to the panel. And as you plan to pick from where Samia has left, perhaps you could shed more light on your specific challenges that women in East Africa face in getting their voices heard and their rights recognized after conflicts or during periods of political change.
Thank you very much, Damaris. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to echo what she said, that we had hoped that the session on gender had been moved from the graveyard shift. Last week, I was at a conference in Abuja, and we were joking that finally we've now earned our spot, at least in the morning hours, afternoon hours. The new fields of climate change, climate justice, technology are now occupying the graveyard shift. But apparently, this is not accurate. That said, again, thanks very much for inviting me. As noted, I work for the International Center for Transitional Justice. I'm a transitional justice expert. Just allow me to step back a bit, because I may assume that there are a few people in this room, and please forgive me, who may not understand what transitional justice is about. So just allow me in a minute just to highlight that this is primarily a global dominant framework in which states that are undergoing transition, political transition, either from authoritarian rule or conflict, rely upon to address legacies of human rights abuses, and also focus on state building by centering the realization of democracy, the rule of law, and again, promoting just governance. At a continental level, we have the African Union Transitional Justice Policy Framework, which is relied upon by a number of African states, which again looks at defining processes and measures depending on each context to address those drivers of conflict and also promote democratic governance. So there's a really close interlink between transitional justice and democratic governance. To many, TJ is often seen as backward looking at what happened in the past. But I believe that one of the critical roles of transitional justice is forward looking at not only addressing these past atrocities, but also how do you introduce reforms that guarantee democratic governance, that promote the rule of law, that promote inclusive societies, that foster healing and rebuilding social cohesion, which is fundamental. As we know, healing is something that is often not taken seriously, but as has been said, that those who have trauma, those who have unhealed pasts, often contribute to these human rights violations. And it often occurs at what is defined as critical junctures. These windows of opportunities, as I've mentioned, those points of transition, and East Africa has had that. Many of our countries. Here in Kenya, you've had multiple of those, but I'd like to primarily look at the post-election violence in 2007, which catalyzed reforms that led to this landmark 2010 constitution, which is celebrated in the region, which sought primarily to address those root causes, those factors that led to the violence, the marginalization, those colonial practices that contributed to these continuing violations. And key among this was the inclusion of provisions that foster gender equality, gender inclusion, address the marginalization of women and other groups. And as many of you know, mostly the 2/3 gender rule that's been held. But as we shall discuss, it's one thing to have a constitution and constitutional aspirations, but the struggle to give meaning to that continues for years and decades, and Kenya is leading in that front. In my own country, Uganda, we had a brief moment in 1986 when we were told it was a fundamental change. We assumed that this was an opportunity. A commission of inquiry was set up, the Odere Commission, which provided a series of recommendations and laid a foundation for the 1995 Constitution, set up an independent ombudsman to investigate human rights violations. But as we saw, the window closed. Despite the inclusion of progressive provisions of gender, including a rule of 1/3 rule, making sure that cultural norms and practices that are discriminatory against women are abandoned, we saw that that did not necessarily particularly change. But again, as I've said, these, I always say, constitutions contain aspirational provisions. A constitution is not a magic wand to say that, for those of you who are religious, Moses went to get the 10 Commandments and they were read out and they were supposed to be complied with. It's a continuous quest to get those implemented. So in Uganda, we have the 1995 Constitution, which talks about extensive rights. Unfortunately, as my good friend Businja Kabumba likes to say, it was an illusion of a constitution, where you have a constitution without a culture of constitutionalism, but at the same time, the soldiers, the NRA soldiers who came into power did not take off their fatigues, military fatigues. They adopted a new constitution, but still kept on the military fatigues. And so we still have, for all intents and purposes, a military regime in Uganda. But coming back to your question, really, as we know that in context of conflict, human rights abuses, gender norms shape how men and women experience these violations. And at a core to that is gender inequality, which defines not just in transitional justice, but also in democratic processes. And as it has been documented, and there are several UN reports that look at the nexus between gender inequality and undemocratic tendencies, because they're both reinforcing. Both of them rely on exclusion, patriarchal norms, and weak accountability. They often align and to enforce these rigid hierarchies that prioritize male leadership while at the same time marginalizing women. We all have these quotas, affirmative action that many of our countries have adopted. I know many hail Rwanda as having the highest number of women representatives in their parliament. I think it's at 63%. And the biggest question is, to what extent has this transformed into substantive representation? I think we saw a clear example when Diane Rwigara wanted to run for the highest political office in the country. What happened at that particular context? She was charged and prevented from pursuing. So we have to question this aspect of quotas and representation. What do they actually lead to? can we have gender representation of these quotas without really tackling the fundamental question of gender inequality, those deeply entrenched patriarchal norms that try to carve out limited spaces of saying, yes, you can be part of the process, but within these particular limits. So it basically become more of a token. You're present, but your power and your ability to influence these processes is very limited. And also at the same time, without necessarily changing these norms, these cultural practices in our communities, as you know, women contribute to the highest amount of unpaid labor. So if you say we want men and women to participate in these political processes or transitional justice processes without taking into account the care burden, care responsibility that many women face and the economic barriers that they face, then it's as good as giving with one hand and taking away with the other, because it's not a level playing field. So it's important to address these aspects. But we also need to think about cultural and institutional resistance. Even when we've had these quotas, and I think for Kenyans with the 2/3 rule, this has been quite evident, that no matter how much litigation, no matter how much effort, there's still that institutional resistance to incorporating these norms. And this is often reinforced by different institutions. So we shouldn't underestimate the role of the media in perpetuating these gender stereotypes or diminishing the role of women in these governance and political processes, ridiculing them or trying to use these stereotypes that tend to intimidate or limit women's participation. And this is very evident in Uganda when our constitution was lauded in 1995, and then suddenly you had all these women members of parliament in parliament. But again, their power, their reach was greatly limited. And anyone who would come up with proposals for gender policies, for example, laws on gender equality in Uganda, are among those that have spent the longest time on the shelf. Right? Domestic relations, laws on domestic violence, and any member of parliament who dares introduce these laws is often ridiculed and at times faces challenges of retaining their parliamentary seat. Aspects of gender-based violence and sexual harassment are pervasive. As you know, in Uganda, we had a vice president, a female vice president, Dr. Specioza Kaziwe, who was appointed at the time, and people had high hopes, and she made what they would call one cardinal sin. She spoke out against the domestic violence that she was experiencing at the hands of her husband, who also had the audacity to go to the media and say, I only slapped her once, as though that was something that should have happened. But again, she was criticized more for speaking out rather than questioning the practice where a man actually slaps his wife, a vice president of Uganda, and justifies it. And so we have all this, and there are many examples, and I believe in Kenya there are many examples, and many of you who have been following news in Nigeria, this senator called Natasha Akpoti, who dared to challenge the Senate president and spoke out against the sexual harassment that she faced at the hands of the Senate president, and she's being dragged to court. She's been charged with cyber harassment, cyber bullying, all because she spoke out. So all these are barriers. It's not enough to say we are now going to allow women to participate, we are going to allow these quotas, without looking at these factors that contribute to these issues. So addressing gender-based violence, addressing stigma, especially for women who have experienced gender-based violence, who come forward, is fundamental. So just allow me to run through a few of my recommendations to this discussion. I think from the onset, a gender lens should be applied, whether you're designing transitional justice processes or whether you're defining democratic processes at that critical juncture. It shouldn't be an afterthought. And as we've seen in many contexts where there are peace negotiations, often and understandably the combatants are men. Right? So when they're negotiating peace, who is in the room? It's the two protagonists. And South Sudan is a good example of that. And I think Sudan as well. Yeah. So women who actually bear the brunt of these violations are often left out. And it takes a sustained movement of women activists to push to say, We need to have the harms that women have experienced acknowledged. We need to have reforms that tackle these drivers of violence and abuse against women acknowledged. And that's when they often say, oh yes, okay, now we'll include gender, but now we limit it to 1/3, no less than 30%, which is often considered a ceiling. But we need to do better than that. It should be considered and integrated from the onset. The other is avoiding tokenism by prioritizing substantive representation of women in both transitional justice and democratic processes. Affirmative action is crucial, but you must go beyond affirmative action to see that genuine policies that promote gender equality, that address gender-based abuses are actually also addressed. And importantly, that address the power dynamics in our society and those structural barriers that limit women from participating. It's also key that to bridge the gap between policy and implementation. And to me, this is very fundamental. You go everywhere, you have these gender policies, you have these constitutional mechanisms, and constitutional provisions that talk about gender inclusion and gender equality, but there's limited enforcement. And at times it's taken as, well, we still have to give society time to catch up. And I think that's one of the challenges of the 2/3 rule. We're saying, progressive realization of society catches up. But as we all know, that power does not cede easily. You must challenge power, and you must be able to push that these changes occur. So I'll leave it at that. I know she's looking at me because I've taken so much time, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much for reminding us that gender lens should always be applied at the heart of any democratic process. So,
I think protection of women in public arena, in political inclusion or political setup or in peace talks, we protect them from cyber attacks, from retaliation. So this is very important, and we need to highlight this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So we'll proceed to our third panelist, who is Dr. Antoinette Kankindi. She's a professor of ethics and political philosophy at Strathmore University. She's a recipient of the Harambee 2017 Prize, an award of promoting equality of the African woman through her project titled The African Women Leadership. So, Professor, welcome so much. And based on your expertise in ethics and philosophy, and beyond laws, beyond policies, how can we build a strong culture of integrity within our public institutions and also political parties in East Africa to truly support and empower women's involvement in governance?
Thank you. Thank you first for inviting me to speak here. Of course, it's not easy to speak on the last panel and the last person on the last panel. Donc d'abord, je salue tous les francophones présents dans la salle. Ça me manque de parler français. Si on a 1 minute pour parler français demain, peut-être j'aurai la chance de vous rencontrer. Sorry, I'm just greeting the French-speaking people. Here, I miss speaking French. So, I mean, I have so much to say. But don't worry, I am a teacher, so I will try and be succinct. Yes. So there are several things first that can be picked from the very first panel this morning, that I would like to address in a way that could answer the question. And I'll stay with the remark that Madame Jerry Kabeberi repeated many times, the 12% of educated Africans, that leaves out 88%. So then I will bring in a comment that my desk mate made earlier when the artists were speaking and saying we have to speak truth to power. Yeah? And then she was asking me, but power knows the truth, right? The ones who are in power, they know the truth. So do they need us to speak truth to them? And she was telling me we have to speak truth to the masses, Because if the people who are supposed to hold the power to account, they should know the truth, right? So to me, the reason why I ended up specializing in both ethics and political philosophy, which are both two sides of what is classically called moral philosophy, that I studied law in the University of Kinshasa. And when I finished law, I was shocked to see that law had nothing to do with justice anymore. And I realized that law was totally toothless before power. And then I realized that when Professor Mbembe here will know that much better than me, because he's much more experienced than me, that the structure of society determines the level of institutions we need. Yeah. The basic needs of food, shelter, and health, and other things have created the complexity of economic relations that society finds itself into. And it's that complexity that demands the need for order that the law should bring in, right? But the law needs a power of enforcement, which has to come from the political sphere, right? These are three different spheres that each one of them has its own identity. Yeah. And in order to build up a society correctly, each sphere should actually fulfill its function without taking over the other spheres. So what are we looking at in today's society? We are looking at the economic sphere that has become so powerful with the different financial structures we have, an aggressive free market run by monopolistic corporations, right? And it has become so powerful that it buys out politics, and politics subjects the law. Then we cannot be surprised that the law has become toothless and cannot really help us solve problems. So when you're looking at the matters from the political party's perspective, which is her question, I tell my students, political parties must disappear. Why? You can throw stones at me if you have any, yeah? But why? Because they are mechanisms of seizing power and keeping it. I repeat that. Political parties are mechanisms for seizing power and keeping it. To the point that the one that wins elections tries to stay in power, and if that means that they have to buy out the opposition, they are going to do that. And that's what we are looking at in the modern society today. And that's why it's so difficult to tell the difference between political parties. Because when they get into power, they just do the same. You can think that they have the same agenda. They have the manifesto they sell to us when they are campaigning, and then they have the same script they follow once they get into power. So when we say that we want to infuse some ethics there, to create some space for women there, I always throw back the question, because I think teachers, we really don't solve problems for our students. We try to teach them how to ask the questions correctly and then find the answer themselves, right? So the thing is this, yeah. Which sphere of governance are we looking at when we say political parties? What kind of aims and purpose we want that sphere to achieve for who, right? So when we know that space of governance, then we should be able to say, so how do we equip women to occupy that space, right? Because they have to be equipped. But the fact of being women doesn't mean that they are going to be able to do it without the preparation required, right? And that is something I think we have lost when we are pushing so much for affirmative action. We've lost the focus on merit, right? And how do people achieve merit when they are capacitated to do so, right? So I don't think that if we have 12% of educated people, that we'll find in the 12% sufficient representation for the 88% women who are not in that bracket. Yeah? So you find that that sphere of the economic sphere that had taken over everything, you see that now it's the corporate world that some of them are so aggressive that they have created foundations to look nice to people that we are not aggressive, we are this good, so don't, yeah. So, but you look at that and you see that in reality, these economic forces that control everything, yeah, have found very good allies in the urban elite of the 12%, right? So now, that urban elite of the 12%, does it really ever identify with the 88%? In order for us to work in the same direction, so that we are uplifting everyone, not just uplifting the urban elite, right? I have another controversial question around the 12%, which is, I ask my students, okay, when we were less educated, were we more corrupt or less corrupt? Less corrupt. And now we have more education and more corruption, right? What does that say? That we have a problem with the education we are imparting. That's why, to me, I want to stop so that you don't tell me I'm good about saying. I want to say that when I say that women should be, we have to identify the sphere of governance, the space of governance they should occupy, and then prepare them to occupy them. It's not just the women, even the young people. Why? Because we need a different type of civic education beyond voters' education, beyond electoral education. Actually, I started a couple of years ago to introduce as an experiential learning for my students in my unit, something we called the Student Civic Initiative, because I want my students to be civically engaged in the community. I take them to marginalized area to do things they have never thought of doing, and they have to raise money to do that themselves. Well, because when I get there and they're like, okay, this is my own country. It's not even 200 kilometers from Nairobi. How come I didn't know this? Yeah. So we need to change that. We have to bring back civism, but a different model altogether. If ICJ and the innovation are interested in this idea, I have a lot of, I've prepared even some curriculum and everything, so you can have a discussion on that, and I can elaborate more on these matters. But I think proper, adequate adult civic education beyond electoral discourse, because the electoral discourse means nothing if political parties are what I just referred to earlier. Yeah, and you can see that we are going to elections, but who is the alternative do we have? Which alternative do we have? Which kind of preparation does this alternative have? If we want to talk transitional justice, I tell people that, you'll forgive me, that we can't talk about transitional justice because we haven't transited yet from a conflict situation to a peace situation, so we can talk about a transition. My compatriots from the DRC can confirm that. Yeah, we've been forever and ever in conflict, so can we talk about transitional justice anywhere? So I mean, let's look at ourselves and think we are educated, but our education has a problem. Let's find a solution to the type of education we want so that we can prepare not only women, but also the young people to occupy the space of governance where the real change will happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was very insightful, and thank you for giving us pointers to reflect on. So we're going to proceed with our fourth panelist, who will intervene virtually. So the ICT team, okay, thank you. So our fourth panelist is Anne Ireri. She's an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and the executive director of FIDA Kenya. She's a women's rights transformative champion with a solid and proven record in law, policy, and advocacy matters within the public and non-governmental sectors. So welcome, Anne Ireri. So as you prepare to intervene, perhaps my question for you will be, what's your perspective from a legal standpoint on the immediate reforms that are best to protect women in context of violence during protests and elections?
Thank you very much, Damaris. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to the organizers of this great initiative. I'm coming from some distance away from the capital in Nairobi, undertaking fieldwork, so I will request you to indulge me not to appear on camera. Having said that, I join in solidarity with my sisters, indeed, in indicating that we had hoped that we have moved from the graveyard shift and that we are actually having women issues being discussed at the opening forums of many conferences and workshops. I think it is a work in progress. However, it speaks to the reality of how we are still perceiving women issues, that they are issues and matters that are not really mainstreamed yet, but are important. And we do hope that with time we are able to have issues of women and girls mainstreamed into every conversation. Straight away to your question, Damaris. In the context of Kenya, allow me to state that we have a constitution that is now over 2 decades old, and in it were various aspirations and guarantees that would really enhance the participation of women in leadership, whether elective or appointive. And in it, one of the things that was identified was that we need to really protect and safeguard women's participation that is often hampered by violence, particularly in an election or political context. And why is this important? I think we have seen over time, when we listen to the testimonials of trailblazers, particularly in the women's movement, who have had to overcome such huge obstacles, particularly in terms of gender-based violence, that was specifically and deliberately instigated to hamper their participation. And so from that, we have been able then to underscore that it is important that we first and foremost understand why violence against women in elections has to be addressed, the impact particularly in terms of reduced women's participation, long-term negative effects including reinforcement of negative gender stereotypes, and generally the erosion of trust in democratic institutions. Women in a lot of our countries occupy, if not more than half, but at least half of the population. And so it is only fair and imperative that any decision making that is going to affect them is also inclusive of their views. And when we look at women in the election context, it's important to also look at the intersectional roles that women play. One, as aspirants, so those who are seeking to get into office. Secondly, we have candidates who successfully go through the final stages of being voted in, whether through political parties or independent candidates. We have women as voters themselves, and then and finally we have women who are officials in various election management responsibilities, and these are also crucial decision makers. And we have seen from our analysis that these different roles that women play in elections also predispose them to different types of violence. Indeed, in Kenya just recently, we had to deal with a very gruesome, unfortunate incident where an election official who was female lost her life, and all credible speculation points out to the role that she plays as an election official. And so we need to be able to then see how do we best protect women legally whilst enhancing their participation and involvement in elections and also just in democracy. And towards this, I have a few suggestions. I'll be very quick. One is that we have to interrogate our legislative and policy frameworks. And within this, we have to be able to see how best do we tighten and provide for specific laws that outlaw violence against women, particularly in politics. And towards that, I think globally we have a good example in South America, particularly in Bolivia, and they're taking good strides in ensuring that within the context of elections, you have particular discourse that really singles out the question of violence against women and looks at the causes and the factors that make them predisposed, particularly during an election or politically charged dispensation. Secondly, is that we have to then look at, as we work towards having standalone policies, what do we do with the current frameworks that we have? And I'll give the case of Kenya, where we have existing legislation, whether in the Sexual Offences Act, the Penal Code, or we are looking at the Political Parties Act and the Elections Act as well. There has been a lot of conversation around specific provisions that would criminalize violence against women. And in addition to having these provisions, having very clear guidelines on how these cases are going to be dispensed with. And why is this important? When we have worked at FIDA Kenya with a lot of candidates, they'll tell you that as women, one of the key choices you have to make, even when you have been violated, is to let that violation go. Because the time you'll take within our criminal justice system to have your matter decided gives your competitor, often who's a man, an edge. So it's a choice of whether I pursue this case later because it's likely to take close to a year or even more. In the interim, I hit the ground running and make sure I don't lose any vote. And so we find that for women, the fact that you have to choose between your personal safety and security and winning an election is not fair. And so we have been at the forefront alongside other institutions in proposing measures, for instance, having limits on when these cases can be decided. We have seen in Kenya election-related disputes can be decided within 6 months. Why not then have specific timelines for violence against women and election-related violence against women that can be determined? Thirdly, is that we can also localize and have faster enforcement through election management bodies adopting protocols and regulations. And I think one of the things we saw a good attempt in the 2022 elections in Kenya was both by the Independent Elections and Boundaries Commission, IEBC, as well as the Office of the Registrar of Political Parties, to really whip political parties to order, to ask them to showcase what gender-based violence protocols they have in place, particularly during party primaries, which we know from history are often the most violent for women, depending on parties, and especially if you are in a large party or a mainstream party, once you sail through the primaries, you're as good as elected. And so we have seen this is where there's a lot of investment of violence that is specifically tailor-made to curtail women from vying, and we've seen testimonials of what women aspirants have had to go through. So through the enforcement as EMBs, they are able to actually enforce at their level having these cases. Then additionally, very quickly, gender-sensitive training, particularly to the criminal justice players. We are looking at lawyers, we are looking at the police and the ODPP, for instance, that's the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Judiciary, and allow me to single out pro bono services. And that's one lesson we learned at FIDA Kenya, that for most women, even just navigating the entire electoral dispute process is a hurdle. And so when you're able to affirmative measures to ensure that you have pools ready of well-trained pro bono services who can quickly be able to move forward, to be able to restore the rights and of women or populations that they've been able to go through, that is important. And additionally, looking at it holistically, where we are looking at one, yes, the ability to have disputes resolved through the available means or channels, particularly the judiciary, but also looking at what preventive and responsive measures. Are we able to speak, for instance, of available shelters where women may feel, even if they're vying for office, they do not feel safe, or safe homes? Are they quickly available, particularly to women who are in the democratic space or who are in the democratic movement and who need speedy and expedient services in terms of their protection to be able to still undertake and participate in the democratic process? And so for us, these are some of the things that we have seen are very important. And we then need to push for accountability, particularly from the duty bearer in terms of then, as we've had laws are not self-implementing, even if we have provisions that safeguard women against violence or increase their participation, how best do we then ensure that we are able to address these issues? And having looked at that, then leads me to the recommendations that we can push and which are tied in a lot, Damaris, to the question of the two-thirds gender rule, which again has been an example of some of the affirmative measures that can be put in place to enhance women's participation in politics. But then why are we not getting it right? And I think as we look at how best to enhance the participation of women, both by looking at factors that impede their involvement, such as violence against women, but also proactively increasing their involvement and participation, certain questions we need to ask that are key. And one is the presence of political will. And political will cuts across. It's not enough, as we heard from the previous speakers, to just have quotas or provisions. It is how well we invest deliberately in making women who are able to vie for office be availed for these particular positions. Secondly, we have to look at the frameworks that impede women's participation, particularly from a legal and electoral framework. And I'll give the example in Kenya. We've had a whole conversation around campaign financing and how it is being used deliberately to impede women's participation. Women are being outspent by their male colleagues for various reasons that I will not get into. But we know that the fact that women are not able to have well-oiled campaign machinery is a huge, huge factor on why they're not being able to be voted in. Thirdly, patriarchal attitudes and cultural norms. We have to go back to socialization. And in patriarchy, allow me to just remind us that it's not just men and boys who have these tendencies. Women and girls are also raised within patriarchal structures. Hence, you have a number of women who still have to be educated and advocated towards to be able to understand the value of having women in office. And then finally, we need to move the conversation, one, in reframing the narrative that it's not so much about women's inclusion. I think we now need to toughen up, particularly from the reality that women's issues seem to be the ones that are at the back of every agenda, including here in Kenya, where under our Bill of Rights, it's only the two-thirds provision that is yet to be attained fully. And perhaps just reframing the narrative that it's not about women's inclusion, it's about facing the tough costs and consequences of having women excluded from decision-making. And we've seen that women have been able to collectively organize and mobilize, particularly around issues such as femicide. And it could be an opportunity then for women to agitate further, because the dialoguing and the appeal of inclusion seems not to catch on traction, possibly now being harsher and really, really specifying that there are certain implications of women's exclusion. And then finally, last but not least, again, on the narrative, I think just building the confidence of women. We have great, great success stories in our country of Kenya and the context we are working with. We may not have a president or a vice president who's a woman, but we have tremendous women governors who've been elected and who are defying odds. We have members of parliament and who've been able to really, really demonstrate that they have brought in value, particularly from a gender lens in terms of gender responsive budgeting, prioritizing gender-based violence. So really amplifying these stories, letting women know that it's not so much about capacity building. There's been a conversation around this, but capacity enhancement. Why is this narrative reframing important? Because you want to increase the numbers and the masses on the pipeline of women who then easily avail themselves for elections, because we've seen in our last election of 2022 from research, out of the pool of candidates who availed themselves, only 18% made it to office, particularly in the context of women. So the more women we can have, the more we can easily make it possible for them to avail themselves in office, dealing with imposter syndromes. Then we should be able to have more women availing themselves for office. I beg to stop there, Damaris, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne Ireri, for that insightful contribution. And what I have picked is that it is not about the inclusion. Right now, we should having this narrative of facing the consequences of excluding women, even in democratic processes. So I think that's very important for us to carry home. So I want to invite the rest of the team to ask questions to the panelists. You can ask directly to a specific panelist.
All right, thank you very much. My question goes to Professor Antoinette Kankindi. You've said something that is very, very profound. You say that political parties ought to disappear because they are tools for seizing and keeping political power. And if I'm to add, I think there have been tools that have been used to, or vehicles that have been used to extend authoritarianism in the continent. And so I know you spoke about it in the context of women inclusion in political leadership, but I wanted to broaden it a little bit in the context of the theme for this particular forum. For a very long time, I've listened to Professor PLO Lumumba criticize the Eurocentric model of democracy, where he says it puts a lot of emphasis on having many political parties as an indicator of democracy. Is it, and of course he says that, you know, as Africans we really need to interrogate the meaning of democracy so that we can include our values and aspirations as a continent, so that we develop a unique model of democracy that meets our aspiration. Is it then your submissions that this new model should come in the form of, you know, zero political parties being there, and, you know, leaders just emerging organically from the crowds and, you know, taking the positions of leadership? Is that your submissions? Thank you.
I think, Damaris, I think we'll take the two questions, then we can answer. Viva, comrades, viva. Viva, comrades, viva. My name is Wangoi Wanjora. I am a policymaker and a community activist working with the social justice movement Nairobi chapter from Gong. And before I ask my question, I'll give a little backstory to my question. In East Africa, there is a couple of indigenous communities ranging from the Tanzania the Maasai in Tanzania, the Sengwer in Embobut Forest, the Batwa community of Congo, the Bennett of Uganda, and the Ogiek of the Mau Forest and Mount Elgon region. These communities, together with the social justice movement Nairobi chapter, formed a women-led East Africa assemblies in an aim to try and combat a lot of injustices were happening in these communities, directly or indirectly affecting women. And these communities, most of them have been driven out of their land, and their land has been possessed by the government. And we have taken these matters to court, including the East African Court. And most of these cases have been won in court, but in action, these communities and these indigenous people still live miserably in terms of the security. The government is constantly torching their homes and evacuating them from their homes. And this is their homes, they know nowhere else to go. My question now is directed to Sister Comrade Kasande from the Transitional Justice team. And my question is, what does implementation look like? Because in most times, when court cases are won, how does this replicate? How can this replicate, and in terms of solidarity? Because these cases, even the Maasai people in Tanzania are still being killed even now. They're still on run from their places of home, from homes they have known for the longest times, from their ancestral land, and this land is being sold to foreign investors. But these cases have been won in court. So how does solidarity in this democracy forum, in terms of East African solidarity, how can we improve that to actualize what is being put in, what is being passed in law to actually be effective kwa ground? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for this question. I know when I throw this consideration out, people find it provocative, but we have evidence that they don't work for us. They work for individuals that are killing the development of our countries. Maybe in some places they have worked, but I don't even know whether in the West the political parties are working for the people. I don't want to go there because I don't want to. Yeah. So I would like to say something. When Professor Lumumba hit hard on the Eurocentric approach to politics, I personally interpret it in a different way than he does, and that is because the model of the West we have inherited or embraced is mostly a liberal democracy that is individualistic in nature because of how it understands the human being and the freedom of the human being as the freedom to do just whatever I want. So there's nothing contrary to the African ideals like individualism, because the African societies are not individualistic. The main values that structure the African society across Africa from north to south are the value of solidarity, the value of hospitality, and the Ubuntu worldview, which means in some of the dialects, the Bantu dialect can mean humanity, humanism, or even the virtue of generosity, right? And I could add to those values the sense of dialogue that is proper to the African communities. That, in which sense? Dialogue in the African communities, of course, you say they sit under the Mugumo tree to solve the problem of this lady who has run away from her home because she was being battered, and then I don't know how they discuss how this matter is going to be solved, right? I still have students who they are about to get married to someone from a different tribe, and the parents are worried and asking, how do these people solve marriage problems in their traditions? Yeah, because they have different traditions. Why? Because there are ways of dialoguing about these matters to solve them. Yeah. So the liberal democracy is the ideology that is really in contradiction with the African values. So when we're trying to squeeze it on ourselves, it's like we are trying to wear a straight jacket when I am weighing 79 kgs and I'm wearing, I don't know which size of jacket, and that's why it's now. And I heard from the earlier presentations, there is the word of moral obligation came back and back. Ethics, requirement of moral standards kept coming back. So the liberalism, the liberal democracy relies on relativism. There is nothing that is a moral standard that we should all of us abide by. And that's what has killed the common good that we should all be working towards if we want to build a community that's cohesive. So when I say that political parties should disappear, I am not saying that we should not organize politically, but we have to find the different ways of organizing politically, because this is killing us, it is not helping us. Now, are we saying that we are not educated enough to devise new ways of mobilizing ourselves into a political action? Yeah? And I'm challenging us beyond a forum like this one, because this, I would say that the people who are here, I don't know you, but I think you are all committed. So we have to talk to the ones who are not committed and convert them to this commitment. So we need to be thinking of this. So which is the new model of political mobilization we can come up with to enshrine our own values and use them to build? I'm going to say something, give me 1 minute, about, because she mentioned the Maasai community. I'm very keen to try to study this community because they have a system that works. In 2022, in Narok County, there was this big event that's called Ilmerchuki, I think. It's like the second stage of initiation of men when they're aged between 28 and 40 something, because they are taking over the leadership of the community. So it's quite interesting because there's one elder who knows the age, the sons of each clan that fall into this age group. And they are called together in one every 17 years. And I was shocked. Like, there's no politicians who have this capacity to mobilize from each homestead young men of this age, and they know them without using computers, without using government record, and they know who is where, who is going to take over which kind of role in the community. And so we still have some ways of political organizing, but we have kind of brushed them off because we are embracing the ones we can't fit in because it's too straight a jacket for our size.
Thank you very much for that question. One of the challenges we face, particularly in this East African region, is the blatant disregard of judicial decisions, the failure to comply with judicial decisions. One of the glaring ones was the landmark 2017 decision by the African Court on Human and People's Rights on the Ogiek community, directing the government to introduce policy reforms, provide compensation, and a series of measures to protect the community. We're now in 2025. They just had a compliance hearing by the state, and still there's very limited that has been done. And we see that minority groups on the continent, and most of them, if you notice, straddle the different countries. So for instance, the Batwa straddle Congo, they straddle Rwanda, and also Uganda, right? So they straddle different parts, and they continue to be excluded. So how does solidarity look? I think one, pursuing the enforcement of this decision. Sometimes it may not be through a compliance hearing, but the small steps, policy decisions within government agencies to see what practical measures can be taken to address some of these challenges, because the courts give specific directives. And at times, the policymakers just simply ignore them or do not even have the ability to address these policy directives. So what can we do as civil society and activists to support this process? But also looking at, this is not just a minority issue, it's a human rights issue. So if human rights of a particular group are being impacted, solidarity is by associating and demonstrating that these are not just about this particular group, but it's about all of us as human beings, as members of this, as citizens. It's a citizenship question. So that's how solidarity shows, allying with these groups, but also pursuing the approaches of strengthening the ability of courts to issue decisions that can be complied with. And perhaps at a political level, mechanisms that have states reflect on why aren't they complying with these court decisions. Unfortunately, we now see a trend of that Article 32 with the African court, which basically shows African governments are not willing to comply with the court decisions, or whether issued at a regional level. We see how the East African Court of Justice has been handicapped. Efforts to try and push its jurisdiction have been limited, and the judges themselves are now increasingly becoming timid. Decisions that we used to have earlier on when the court was set up are now being more or less pulled back, because the courts now realize that we issue these decisions and the governments may not necessarily comply. So it goes back to the citizens of the continent, or in this case, the citizens of the East African region, to push for the independence of these courts, but also the enforcement of their decisions. Thank you.
I got interested in the professor's theory of disappearance of the political party. Actually, this is not the first time for me to hear about it. In Sudan, we have a movement of young people who are calling for disappearance of political parties, and but don't be happy, because actually they don't have, they have like a vertical structure. So and they have like the literature of how they are going to get to the power. But for the 3 years of the revolution, they started to organize themselves, but they couldn't come up with how they are going to do it on ground, not in theory. And I think academia have a role in this to bring ideas for this theory. But in the same time, I'm thinking of why Westminster democracy doesn't fit Africa. Or the third world as generally. But when I look to the India, democracy and experience is something very unique, and it has to be studied. And we need to study how the Indian managed to have a democracy sustainable, and they have development, and they don't have this kind of conflict over the power. So for me, I don't, right now I have like a concrete or final word about it, but always I'm saying election and democracy, Westminster democracy, like the exam, it is not the perfect way to know the students, the level of the student, but till we have another one, we need to improve this kind of democracy. Thank you.
Let me say something just about India, which I don't know very much because I haven't researched it, but I think it's a country that is very proud of its own culture, and it adjusts its systems to its culture. So it's not that we are trying to replace, they're not trying to replace their own culture by another one, and which is where we falter.
Thank you so much. A round of applause to our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for your very brilliant and insightful contributions and also recommendations that